posterity, we are taking something from Illustrator, bringing it into After Effects, and then turning it into a vector shape that we can then animate the lines of. So right click, create, and then create shapes from vector layer. So it kind of nested in a weird spot here. But when we hit create shapes from vector layer, that's gonna chug away and come back with a new layer called layer 1 outlines. So if I look at my layer 1 outlines file here, it looks pretty identical, but the difference between the two is when I twirl them open, this layer 1 outlines has a little section called contents instead of just transform. So instead of just the option of moving it around, we now have this other little chunk under here called contents. And if we keep toggling things open, eventually we'll get down to the kind of actual geometry of the thing. So if I keep twirling open, eventually I should be able to end up at a little piece about the path of this geometry. So path, when I click on path down in my timeline, down at the bottom here, you can see that the handles or corners of this shape are now editable. So I can click and drag around the actual geometry. So instead of just a picture, now we have a piece of vector geometry that we can play around with and animate, which is quite nice. So just like anything else in After Effects, the path, the shape of this geometry is something we can animate as well. So if I twirl down far enough, eventually you should be able to get to a layer called path that has a little stopwatch next to it. And just like anything else, when we turn on the stopwatch, that essentially turns on record for any changes that you make to that shape. So I've turned on the stopwatch, I've got my first keyframe, and if I move forward in time a little bit, maybe up 10 seconds, and then change the shape of that object, either by, transforming it, or just by kind of grabbing these little corners. You might have to make sure that you're clicking on the subgroup that says path specifically. That's going to let me grab the individual corners. Now After Effects is going to animate in between those two shapes. It's going to go from A to B, sometimes slowly. Yeah, question? Yeah, for sure. So going back to our Illustrator layer, so I can just start from scratch on this one. We've got our Illustrator layer brought into After Effects. I'm seeing my little rectangle. We just have to right click on that layer, right click, hit create, and then create shapes from vector layer. No problem. And again, this just creates that like traced outline. It's not very smart. Maybe there's a better way to do this since I came up, but it seems to actually like physically go in and trace your Illustrator file. So if your Illustrator file is quite heavy, this can take quite a long time. So just something to keep in mind. I don't know why it doesn't know how to read the vector information as vectors. It has to like trace it somehow. Anyway. But yeah, again, this is a good way to grab something we can animate. You can also create shapes and geometry inside of After Effects itself, so you don't have to import it from Illustrator to start with. I'll just warn that it's a little bit annoying and kind of tricky to work with. If you grab the pen tool up at the top here, this is one way to start like making geometries, and you can play around with the fill and stroke of these geometries. These are properties you can animate as well. So if I twirl open this little polygon that I've opened or that I've drawn, if I keep opening up the contents, you can eventually get to the stroke and the fill of this object. So this is something we can animate as well. So I can turn on the stopwatch next to color, move forward in time, and then change the color to something else, like blue. And then in between, it'll animate from that red color, move through the color spectrum until it gets to blue. So fill and stroke are something you can animate alongside path. We can do this at the same time. So at the same time that it's changing colors, I can also have the shape, the path of that shape change too. So again, just turn on the little stopwatch, move forward in time, and then play around with some of those little corner pieces. If it's not letting you grab the individual corner piece, you can also hold down shift and click. It's kind of like in Photoshop or Illustrator. Holding down shift will let you grab that anchor point individually. So you can just kind of keep stacking animation properties on top of each other. So now it's changing shape while it's changing color. Is that working for everybody so far? Any questions? Yeah. Oh, good question. So it can be a little bit picky about what it lets you do. So if you're clicking on the path, sometimes it'll, like you're saying, only let you drag the whole object around. It's quite finicky about the specific little like layer that you have selected on the left-hand side. So sometimes you just have to make sure that you've twirled down to where it specifically says path. And if it's still not letting you kind of grab those individual corner points, you can try holding down shift and clicking on one of them, and then it'll kind of like sub-select that little piece. If that doesn't work, I don't think there's like an anchor point tool in After Effects the same way there would be in Illustrator or Photoshop. So definitely try to just keep clicking shift. Or you can hit P for the pen tool, and sometimes that will kind of force it into thinking about points. Oh, actually, sorry, P isn't for pen tool. P is for position. That's a lie. The pen tool is G. G. Did that work? One of those. Okay, amazing. So we've got our little keyframes controlling the shape and the color of this little object here. And by default, our After Effects animation will move smoothly between these two. And the speed at which it's going from A to B is consistent. So if I move these points a little bit closer together in terms of how the shape changes, so it happens a little bit quicker, you can see it's moving very smoothly from A to B. So A to B. And this can be good, but sometimes this kind of form of motion can be a little bit jarring. So it starts completely static, moves at a consistent speed, and then stops very suddenly. And if you remember, if we kind of throw back to our principles of animation, I don't know if the slides are in here for that one. But essentially we had that idea of squash and stretch. This idea that like motion isn't always continuous. There's these kind of, an object isn't perfectly always moving at the same speed, starting from 0 and then moving at 100% full speed. There's always this kind of moment of like acceleration and deceleration with animation. So it might look a little bit abnormal or strange for an object to not be moving at all, then suddenly be moving at full speed, and then stop really suddenly. And so there's ways to control how quickly it's moving from point A to point B in After Effects. And this is through a sneaky little operation called the graph editor. So there's a button for the graph editor just right here. It's very small, but it's at the top of your timeline. The icon is like a little chart. And if we press the graph editor, this whole other scary interface pops up. And nothing's gonna really show up if we don't have any layers selected. But if I click on my path, you can see that now there's like this little bar. And the units on the left-hand side, so our little y-axis, the x-axis is still time. So as we move forward in time, it's tracking the speed of our object. So the y-axis is how quickly it's moving in units per second. So in this case, since it's our path, it's counting like how many units or pixels is it moving per second. And right now that's a straight line. It goes from no motion at all to very suddenly, now it's moving at 1 unit per second. And then it stops really dramatically. So that's what this little graph or chart means. If I toggle out of this, that's what these little diamond shapes represent. A diamond means that it is very sharply starting and stopping. But there's a way to change the way that this motion starts and stops. We can control with a little bit more of a gradient how it starts to come into motion and then stop moving. So if you right click on one of these little diamonds, one of our keyframes, and then come down to keyframe assistant. So right click on the diamond and then keyframe assistant. There is this option here called Easy Ease, which is a goofy name. So right click, keyframe assistant, and then Easy Ease. And when you click that, your diamond is going to turn into this little hourglass shape. And when I hit play, you can see that the motion is now suddenly a little bit smoother. It doesn't start at 100% velocity. It kind of takes its time to ease into it. So if I toggle back over into my graph editor, so this little graph editor icon again, you can see now that graph looks super different. So it's kind of, instead of a straight, perfectly jarring line up at 100%, it starts from 0 and then eases its way into it a little bit. To zoom in on our footage, right now this is kind of a little bit tiny, a little bit tough to look at. I'm gonna click this little zoom bar down at the very bottom. There's 2 icons of mountains. There's like a tiny mountain and then a big mountain. And the closer you move towards big mountain, the more it's gonna zoom you in on your footage. The same is true in graph editor or just regular timeline. The mountain will zoom you in and out of time. So back in my graph editor, I can see that I've got this funky little parabola shape. And there's these yellow anchors here that I can click and drag to control the shape of that parabola. And this is essentially influencing how quickly an object moves or starts to speed up or slow down. So if I crank this up really high, for example, if I drag the parabola to be quite pointy, you can see when I play it back, what we get is a really slow start, and then it starts to move really quickly. So slow start, and then whoop, picks up a lot of speed real fast. And vice versa, if I drag the this little yellow handle to the other direction, I can have it start really quickly and then slow down in the middle a little bit. So that's what the graph editor is doing. It's controlling how quickly you're moving from A to B. I did not understand this at all when I first used it. It took me a long time of playing around with it to get it. So if you're looking at this and it's making your stomach drop, don't worry. Don't worry about interacting with it at all. Just know that it's a possibility for controlling motion between A to B. The shortcut for this one is F9. So if you're on a Mac, you just have to hit function F9. On a PC, just go straight for F9. You can toggle this on and off again just by right-clicking, going to Keyframe Assistant, and then Easy Ease on and off. So just know that that is an option. The last thing I'll mention before we move on to working with footage is just the nature of drawing and tracing shapes in After Effects. So anytime you're working on a shape layer, you can see this kind of purple color in After Effects. It's smart enough to know that you're trying to draw a shape, a little piece of geometry that will have kind of a fill and a stroke to it and that you can animate. However, if you're clicking on any other kind of layer in After Effects, so maybe I'll just turn on my little Illustrator layer again one more time. This isn't a shape layer. So when I go to draw something on top with my little pen tool, when I start drawing, you can see the line has this like funky pink color. And when I close the shape, it hasn't made a new shape. Oops, get out of here. It hasn't made a new shape for me. It has just kind of hidden everything behind what I've drawn. So drawing on top of a layer that's not a shape layer creates a mask on that layer. And a mask is exactly the same thing as it would be in like Photoshop. It's essentially just a crop to whatever that shape is that you've drawn. And you can see when I click on my little Illustrator layer here, there's a new section underneath it called Masks. And this is where that shape that I'd drawn is starting to show up. So it's coming in as a mask. It's cropping what's shown of my Illustrator file to the shape that I have drawn. And this can be quite powerful because you can animate these masks as well. So I can have the mask start out really small, turn the stopwatch on for mask path, move forward, and then have it kind of expand into a different shape. So you can animate how something appears on the screen. And I use masks a lot with footage, specifically with, I don't know if I have an example up here at the moment. Maybe not. Anyway, I thought it was kind of a cool effect to have like footage in the background and then crop that footage using a detailed kind of layered mask on top of it. So I would have like footage in the background and then have maps on top of it and crop the footage to those maps, which was kind of a fun way to play around. But just know that there's lots of cool things you can do with masking footage in and out of After Effects. If you don't want to do a mask though, you just want to make some geometry in After Effects, just make sure that you come up to layer and create a new shape layer here. That's going to let you draw any kind of geometry that you want on here. There's also some shape tools you can use. There's a rectangle tool. If you keep pressing Q, it'll toggle through the different types of geometry you can create. So circles, hexagons, stars, all of these different little shapes we can create by pressing Q. And you can see it just kind of nests them under that shape layer. Each one exists. If we twirl open contents, it's kind of its own little object there. But that's pretty much it for vector motion. We're gonna move away from dealing with specific vectors. Does anybody have any questions before I move into working with some footage? Okay, cool. I'm gonna delete all of this nonsense. I don't really need it anymore. Delete. And we're gonna start with, actually, I think we'll start with the skate footage. So we'll start with After Effects example 2. The video should just be of this guy. And it's useful because there's some good colors in this image we can kind of latch onto and start to explore some of the tracking function in After Effects. So I'm going to bring in my skate footage Again, there's some sound on this one, so I'm just gonna turn my volume off on my laptop. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna click and drag it into my little project bucket on the left-hand side. If you want to be more formal, you can come up to File, Import File, and then just navigate to that MP4. But we've got our footage showing up on the left-hand side. I want to work with it down in a little composition. So I'm just going to drag it down to my timeline down at the bottom here. And now it's created a little composition or group for me to work in. That composition is the length of my footage and the size of my footage, which is quite nice. So I brought it into the bucket on the left, I've dragged it down into the timeline on the bottom, and now I'm ready to work with this footage using the tracker in After Effects. So I'm gonna make sure that I have this tracker panel turned on the right-hand side. By default, this probably is not going to show up for you, so you're gonna have to turn it on. And you can do so by coming up to Window, up at the very top, tippy top. So Window, and then making sure that Tracker is checked on. It should show up in the right-hand side for you, but it might just pop up as like a little free floating window somewhere. So Window and then Tracker. Right above Wiggler. I don't know what Wiggler is. Actually, what is Wiggler? Who knows? We're gonna ignore that. So Tracker, there's a couple of different types of ways to start tracking motion inside of a footage. If I click on my piece of footage specifically within my composition, the tracker should kind of light up a little bit and give us some options to work with. If you don't have anything selected, it's going to be grayed out. But you can also choose your motion source from this little drop down here to get started. So either click on your layer or choose the footage from your little motion source drop down. And to start with, we're going to choose this option in the bottom left-hand corner here called Track Motion. So I'm going to click on Track Motion. If it isn't open already, it might open up a separate little window or tab for you in your preview that's kind of diving specifically into that layer. So instead of a composition view, so looking overall at your composition, there's going to be a view looking specifically at your footage layer. So I'm just going to drag this open a little bit so we can see it better. You can see what happens is once we've clicked Track Motion, it'll pop up with this guy here, this little square that says Track Point 1. And this is something you can drag around. And when you go to click and drag it around, you can see that it kind of gives you this little like magnified view. And the point of this tracker is essentially to look for certain pixels and try to follow those pixels as they change through time. So let's say I'm interested in this guy's shoe. I'm actually going to zoom forward to an earlier point in my composition, maybe around like 2 seconds or so, where we first start to see his shoe pop up, a nice blue shoe. And I'm going to click and drag this track point onto the nice blue color of his sneaker. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that there's a couple of different shapes associated with this track point. So there's an outer rectangle, an inner rectangle, and these little crosshairs. So the crosshair is looking for like a very specific point in space, a specific pixel that you're trying to track. This inner rectangle is essentially the area that you're interested in mathematically kind of accounting for. So this is your, okay, I want to precisely follow these points in space. And then the outer rectangle is like a little more of a loose, broader area, just of kind of a context window for After Effects to follow. You can play around with the scale of these. Generally, the bigger you make these, the more math and computation it's trying to do. I'm not sure if bigger window necessarily correlates to better results, but you can play around with this at your own discretion. Basically, you just want to kind of get your rectangle roughly around the object that you're interested in, with your inner rectangle focused on kind of those core pixels that you really want to follow. And once you're ready, we can make sure that there's a few little check boxes over under tracker, position, rotation, and scale. Right now we're just interested in position, and by default this should probably be the only thing that's turned on. So we're just going to make sure that position is checked on. And then to start the process of After Effects analyzing where these pixels go, you just have to hit under Analyze. There's a little Analyze Forward button. So there's a rewind and a forward or advance button. The very rightmost one, if you click it, will just kind of go like frame by frame essentially. And you can see what's happening is that track point is starting to move across the footage. It's trying to follow those pixels. So as we click this forward button, it's trying to keep track of that spot on that dude's shoe. And it's doing a pretty good job actually so far. So you can toggle forward frame by frame if you're anxious, or you can just hit the play button, Analyze Forward. That's just one to the left of that, and it'll start to chug automatically. So I'll hit play. And if I zoom out a little bit and start to scroll back through my footage, we can start to see what's going on here. So it's generated all of these little points. If I twirl open my footage down in the timeline, you can see there's a new little section here that's popped up called Motion Trackers. And if I keep twirling open until I get to tracker 1, track point 1, you can see what it's done is created a whole bunch of keyframes for where it thinks that point in space is across the footage. And as I scroll through my footage from left to right, you can see that little track point box moves across the screen according to where that foot is. And it does a pretty great job up until we get to the point where his arm crosses in front of his foot. So it's following those pixels quite nicely and with pretty decent control until we get to the spot where his arm cuts in front. And that's the point where it kind of like loses the plot. It doesn't know where the shoe has gone. It panics, starts to attach to his arm, and then kind of tracks his arm forward instead of the shoe. And that's because of some of the settings that we have under our tracker. And so if we come back under this little tracker panel and hit options, you can see some of the under the hood stuff that's going on with this little tracker. So you can choose from a few different channels of like what exactly the tracker is searching for, if it's an RGB value, if it's a luminance, if it's a saturation. So you can play around with these different things if you're finding it's struggling with your specific footage. For this one, luminance seems to work pretty well. But there's this option down at the bottom, one little drop down that by default is probably set to adapt feature. And this is what's causing it to, when it loses the shoe, latch onto this dude's arm. So we currently have it set to, when it gets to a point where it's lost the pixels that it's interested in, it's like, oh shit, I don't know where those went at all. They've disappeared. It picks a new feature that's kind of within its little window and says, okay, you know what? We're moving on. We're going to follow what's going on in this little box now. So it starts tracking the pixels for his arm. That's because it's set to adapt feature if confidence is below 80%. So After Effects is doing the math on how confident it is that it's following the original pixels that it picked. If it gets to a threshold below 80%, so it's less than 80% confident, it's still tracking those OG pixels. it's going to jump and attach to something else. It's got codependency issues with adapt feature turned on. But there's a different way to approach this. If you don't like that it's jumping to something else and attaching to it, you can choose a different option called stop tracking from this dropdown. And this one will be a little bit more responsible. If it gets to a point where its confidence is below a certain threshold, it'll just stop and let you kind of adjust manually what it's trying to latch onto. So I'm going to choose stop tracking from this little dropdown instead and hit OK. I'm going to delete my track point altogether. I'm just going to try to reanalyze the footage a little bit starting from here. And now that I have my options set to stop tracking, it will be a little bit more slow going and responsible, but it won't latch onto random stuff. So I'm going to drag my track point again onto his shoe, widen the rectangle a little bit so we make sure he's got his whole foot situation going on in there. And now when I hit play or analyze forward, it'll only go until it gets to a point where it's not super confident anymore. So it'll render up to a certain point and then stop and essentially ask for reassurance. It'll double check. You can adjust your little track point and then keep hitting play until the next point when it loses confidence. So you can see now I've got to this point where the arm comes in. That's when it starts to lose the plot a little bit. So I can really kind of zoom in until the point where it loses it or where it stops analyzing, adjust my track point. In this case, it's because his shoe gets really quite shadowy. It doesn't really know exactly where to look because the color of it has changed so much. But by adjusting that track point a little by little, we can go back in and make sure that it's locking to the right object. If it ever kind of grabs the wrong thing, so in this case, it seems to have latched on to his skateboard instead of his shoe, we can just go back to that point in time where it's lost the plot and adjust that track point to the shoe once more, and then toggle forward in time. If it's really being tricky, you can just kind of go frame by frame and make sure that it's locking to that shoe. And you should eventually get to a place where your footage all the way through is attaching nicely to his foot. For this example, it's probably not going to be perfect, but now if we hit play, you can see that track point locks pretty well to his shoe until it gets to a point where it kind of like dissolves. Is that working for everybody so far? Any questions? Yeah.
My original track point doesn't seem to be like locking.
Oh. Okay, good question. So when you move forward in time, it's not like following any specific point, it's just kind of staying put.
Yeah, it's just staying.
So you might have to, first of all, just double check that you're moving forward by clicking the little analyze button. You're hitting analyze. Okay. If it's not moving or adjusting at all, it might just be a function of that initial window being too small or maybe too big. So it's maybe a Goldilocks situation of playing around with the rectangle around the track point. And then just making sure that you've got position turned on and analyzing forward. If it's still giving you issues, I can take a look at it in a few moments. But from here, we've got a whole bunch of little keyframes. And what we need to do is kind of grab those keyframes and make them usable so that we can start to do those kind of fun, funky annotations like we saw in Stranger Than Fiction. So these points aren't super useful to us yet until we really apply them to something. So once I'm happy with these track points, they look like they're following the plot relatively okay. I'm going to come down to where it says Edit Target. And right now we don't have anything to apply our motion to. We only have one footage layer. We don't have any like geometry or objects that we want to apply this to. So before we go through and hit OK, you can see it's grayed out because there's nothing to select really, nothing to apply these track points to. Before we do that, I'm going to create a new layer. I'll come up to Layer, New, and then I'm going to choose this option here that's called Null Object. And a null object is exactly what it sounds like. There's nothing going on inside of it. It's kind of like an empty placeholder, but it's really great for holding properties of something that you want to reference at a later point. So a null object we're going to use here to absorb these position track points that we've created. And then it'll be really easy to reference this null object with any other types of text or geometry that we want to annotate with. So again, I'm just going to come up to Layer, New, Null Object. You can see it'll make, if I look at my little composition view on the left-hand side, what it does is create this kind of like empty red square. And again, it's a null object. It's not really there. It's not really doing anything. If we twirl it open, there's kind of nothing to it. But it's a really great container to absorb information. So I'll come back to my track points and come back to that option here where it says Edit Target. So what do we want to apply this motion to? I'll hit Edit Target, and under Layer, now it's going to let me choose that null, my null number 1 that I have selected here. So I'm going to select my null and hit OK. And then before anything happens, you can see nothing really happened. We have to hit Apply. So down in the bottom right-hand corner of our tracker, to finalize everything and copy over those track points to our null geometry, just have to make sure that you hit Apply. It'll ask what dimensions you care about. Obviously, we care about both X and Y, so you should be able to just hit OK. And now you can see my null object suddenly has all of the characteristics of those track points. It moves in the same way from beginning to end. If you go to preview your footage, you're not going to see that null move around again because it's not a real object. It doesn't exist there, but we get the gist of it by looking at where it's moving in our composition by scrolling forward and back. So I'm going to get out of my layer specific view. So it'll either be kind of a new tab that's up at the top here where your composition used to be, or a new window that's popped up. I'm going to get out of here and zoom back out to my composition view. So I'm going to get out of my layer view. Now we're just looking at the composition. We've got our footage, we've got our null, and now we're ready to start adding in some geometry or annotation. So I'm going to create some text. Maybe I want to label his shoe. I'm going to come up to Layer, New Layer, and then create a text object. That's going to make a nice little empty text layer. And on this empty text layer, it should automatically turn on your type tool, or you can also just hit Command T, Command or Control T. And I should be able to click and drag to make a nice little text box for myself. just up in my composition up here. I can start typing. And maybe I'll type out nice shoes. There should be a little window that opens up on the right-hand side for the properties of that text. So you can change the font, the size of it, the weight. So maybe I'll do a nice bold Helvetica. And so I have my nice new text layer. It says nice shoes, but it's not tracking to my footage yet. We have to take those properties of the null. So the null object that we've created, our little placeholder, we can steal the properties of that object by using the pick whip. So last class we used the pick whip to create a series of relationships between those parts of the robot arm. We were able to like steal the properties of the parent object so that the baby would always move relative to the parent. So now I'm gonna make a baby out of nice shoes. I'm gonna grab my nice shoes layer, click on the little spiral, so my pick whip, and drag it to my null object. So now my nice shoes is always going to be the baby of my null object. And when you move forward in time, that text should track pretty nicely to where the null was. We can do the same with different types of layers. So maybe I want to create a little leader line or something. I can come up to layer, new shape layer, and start to draw in using the pen tool, maybe a little leader line from his shoe up to the text or something. The stroke's a little bit thick, so I'll drag it down. And then again, just use the pick whip to parent it to the null object. So now both the leader line and the text are following where that null is moving. Is that working for everybody? Any questions? Okay. This is pretty much the basics of our track motion option here. You can do a lot with this really basic function. If you're finding that it's quite jumpy, like in this case, it's kind of jumping around a bit, we can go into our little null object here, twirl, open, transform, and then zoom in on each of these little keyframes. Sometimes the jumpiness comes from the fact that there truly is so many keyframes. And it's just trying to be a little bit too specific. So if you're finding it's really super jumpy, you can kind of come in and delete some of these keyframes that aren't totally essential. And it might move a little more smoothly from keyframe to keyframe. So again, if it's a little too jumpy, just try deleting any excess keyframes that aren't totally essential. Or you can also try turning on easy ease. I maybe wouldn't turn on easy ease for all of these keyframes, but if you really whittle it down and it's still giving you trouble, you can turn them into those kind of smooth transition keyframes. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for track motion. Now we're going to jump into our other piece of footage and start to play around with track camera. So it follows a lot of the same principles, but applies it in a slightly different way. I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff. I don't really need it anymore. You can leave it there if you like. And And I'm gonna drag in my other piece of footage. This is kind of the New York skyline view. I picked this one because it's a really relatively small file. I'll drag it into my little project browser here. And then drag it down onto the timeline. You can also always just right click on a piece of footage and select new comp from selection. A comp is a composition. That'll make its own little composition scaled to your nice piece of footage. And we've got our pretty little New York skyline going on. I'm going to make my composition shorter. If you ever want to trim the length of your composition, so maybe you don't want it to run the full minute and a bit, I want to trim it down to maybe like, I don't know, 45 seconds instead. You can grab the handles of the work area that we were playing around with last time. So again, it's just this kind of thick gray bar up at the top of your timeline. I'm going to drag that to where it says 45 seconds. If you ever want to snap it, either to kind of like a number in time or to your playhead. So let's say you have your playhead set up really specifically at 45 seconds. You can hold down shift when you're dragging that gray bar around with the blue handle and it'll snap to your playhead. So shift will snap it. Once you have your little gray work area ruler set to the time that you're interested in, we can just right click on it and hit trim comp to work area. So this is a nice way to kind of like trim it down quickly. So right click, trim comp to work area, and this will snap it down to 45 seconds. Your footage still exists, so if we drag this footage around, it's still there outside of that 45-second window. But you can see it kind of like cuts off when we drag it around. It cuts off where that initial 45-second mark was. If you want to get it back, you can just kind of click and drag on where that bar starts to gray out. So you can click and drag it back so it comes back into our scene. So we've got our footage and it's a length that we are happy with. If you ever want to change the length of your composition, maybe now it's too short and you want to bring it back, make it longer, you can come up to composition and then composition settings or control or command K. This is where you can control the size of your composition or artboard essentially. The frame rate is in here, so more frames per second is more intensive on your computer, but essentially smoother motion. So that's always kind of a trade-off you'll be playing with. And then duration down at the bottom here. So I can change this from 45 seconds to whatever I want. Maybe I'll make it a nice even 45 and hit OK. So that's how we can control the overall length of this little segment. Again, it's different from your footage. Your footage still exists in its entirety. It's just sitting inside of this window of time that we've defined. So now I'm going to use one of the other tracking tools, Track Camera. Clicking on my footage, I'm going to choose this top left button, Track Camera. And this is going to trigger a kind of computationally intensive process of analyzing in the background. And essentially what this is doing, Track Camera is running through every single frame in this image and mapping all of the pixels as a totality and trying to essentially connect the dots between those pixels to understand where they might exist in 3D space. It's kind of a little bit of witchcraft. It's really cool. You should get some effect controls opening up in the left-hand box. So you should see 3D camera, maybe it'll be in a different window, but you should see this little 3D camera effect controls start to pop up here. Right now in the top left, you can see it just says initializing for me. So depending on how fast your computer is, hopefully your computer is faster than me, it may already be done this process, but you can see now once it's finished, quote unquote, initializing, it starts running through percentages. So you can see it's toggling through every single frame of this piece of footage. It might give you a little time estimate for how long it's going to take. Depending on the size of the footage and how long it is, this might take a very long time, but hopefully it's not too bad because this is a relatively small piece and not too long. You can see it's going through, toggling through every single frame. And then once it's got all of that information, you can see this scary blue bar turns into a scary orange bar called solving camera. So it's stitching all of those points together. And from that information, it's trying to interpret or interpolate how the camera might have initially existed relative to those points in space. So it's kind of an incredible feat of technology, in my opinion. But right now it's looking at all of those pixels and trying to analyze or understand where the original camera point of view might have been from relative to all of those points that it's identified in space. Once it's solved the camera, we can pop into a slightly different view and take a look at how that camera might be acting in 3D space. After Effects secretly has the ability to exist in 3 dimensions. Right now it looks like it's in 2D space, but we'll take a look at a view that is much more kind of 3D. So you can actually do kind of basic 3D stuff in After Effects as well, which is kind of crazy. But hopefully this solving camera doesn't take too long. Is that working for everybody so far? Any questions? Again, this can be kind of computationally intensive, so if you're working on an important project, just make sure you hit save before running this operation. After Effects in general can be very, very heavy. What we should get out the other side once this is finished running is a new little layer that pops up. It'll probably be like a pink color, and it should be our camera object. And that'll again exist in 3 dimensions. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it finally finished rendering, and you can see what it's done as I scrub forward in time. It's created all of these little tracking points for different objects that it's able to identify in what it considers to be 3D space. If you don't see these objects, these little points pop up, just make sure you're clicking on your actual footage and clicking on within that footage under Effects, the 3D camera tracker. If I twirl that open, you can see there's some details about what's going on here. If you still don't see the points, like if they're not showing up for you, you might just have to play around with the track point size, which is a variable in our effect controls on the left-hand side. So track point size, you can see if I crank this up, those little X's get really big, or I can make them much smaller. So what's going on here is it's created a whole bunch of individual pixels to follow across the 3D space. We actually have to do one more step to get our camera, and that's to click this big Create Camera button here. So again, on the left-hand side under our effect controls, we're going to choose the big Create Camera button. Okay. So you can see once we've hit Create Camera, now there's a new pink layer on our timeline, 3D Tracker Camera. And in a default view, we're probably not really going to see too much. But if I change the view that I'm looking in, which I might have to make my composition preview window a little bit bigger to get to this little navigation over on the right-hand side. So there's a little drop down here controlling where our perspective is looking from. This is very similar to your viewport in Rhino. So like top left, back, right, bottom, front. All of those options are here for looking at your footage in 3D space, which is crazy. By default, it'll be set to active camera. So that's the camera that our footage is looking from. But if I switch to something like a top view, for example, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see there's this funky little triangle that should exist somewhere in space. And if I zoom forward and backward in my footage, it starts to move around. This triangle shape is the 3D camera that it has interpolated. So we've got from the tiny little bottom point down at the bottom, that's kind of our point of view. That's like the lens of the camera. And then the triangle that it kind of extends out in space is essentially like the range of view, or the picture plane that it's creating for that camera. So we've created this 3D camera in space, which is kind of incredible. This is a top view, so like a little plan view. And if we zoom out far enough, we might be able to see somewhere in the background, oh, maybe it's not that far actually, our 3D camera tracker points. They might exist somewhere in space we can see. Maybe not. We might have to create some objects first. But we can use and reference this 3D camera to start introducing other geometry into our scene. So if I go back to our active camera view, so I'm going to get out of this top view. There's also, you can just go to like a 3D custom view and see that that's our little like 3D camera in space there. But I'll go back to our active camera view. Again, this is our nice little footage. I've got my 3D camera tracker points under my initial footage layer. If I come back to those points, so I'm going to make sure that I'm clicking on 3D camera tracker under my footage. If you start to hover around some of those points, you can see you can highlight them. And if you're in just the right spot, it might start to come up with this little picture of a bullseye icon. It'll start to triangulate between usually 3 points. And this is After Effects' best guess for what might be a flat surface. So from these points, we can start to select multiple points in order to create this kind of target surface to work with. So maybe I'll go over to, I think this is the Empire State Building, and I can click some of these individual tracking points by holding down Shift. I can select multiple. Ooh. Or I'll crash my computer. One of the two. Okay, I didn't like that. But essentially by holding down multiple tracking points, you can create that little bullseye. And that can act for us as like a reference plane in 3 dimensions for us to work with. Hopefully I didn't lose too much. Maybe that's a sign to stop and wrap up a little early. So we'll carry on with camera tracker stuff on Friday. Let's see if it saved anything. Maybe hit save yourself. It's kind of insane. It uses so much energy to render the individual frames. It always shocks me how slow and insane it is. But yeah, it will drain your battery and your life force. So. I know. You can probably hear my computer. It's not happy. So a good lesson learned. Frequent saves is the way to go. We'll stop there because I lost all of my progress, but we'll pick up where we left off on Friday and show you how you can start to introduce objects like text and shapes into your 3D camera scene. Cool. Okay, have a good week, guys. See you on Friday.